Hello, and welcome to the North Carolina Museum of History and the Cultural Education Day, held in conjunction with our 29th annual American Indian Heritage Celebration. Our presenter, Martin Saniga, will begin in just a moment, but we want to start with a few notes. We begin with a land acknowledgement. Remember, you can ask questions in the chat. We'll do our best to respond to them and to share them with Martin toward the end of the presentation. We have lots of additional resources about American Indians in North Carolina on our website, nc-aihc.com. And we thank the following sponsors of the North Carolina Museum of History Foundation, helping to make this event possible. And let's get started. Welcome to you, Martin. Martin is a citizen of the Sappony Tribe from the High Plains community in Person County, North Carolina, and Halifax County, Virginia. He has been creating traditional artwork and teaching lifeway skills for nearly 25 years. He has lots to share with us, so I'm going to let him take it away. What are you sharing with us today?
So what I'm talking about today is using our traditional clothing as Native people and bringing that to today's time. So the presentation is Historic Clothes in a Modern World. This really came out of a drive. I grew up, like a lot of folks did, going to powwow. Powwow culture is relatively new here on the East Coast. It comes here in the 60s. And with that powwow culture comes a lot of aesthetics from communities, from tribes, from nations that didn't have any historic reference to Virginia or North Carolina. You're looking at like Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa folks. A lot of those styles that we see at powwow aren't from here. The songs aren't necessarily from here. Now there are folks now creating songs in our own languages from North Carolina that fulfill those roles for men's traditional or women's traditional, women's fancy, women's jingle. But all of those dance styles, for the most part, are brought to us. And with those dance styles comes clothing, accoutrement, regalia that isn't representative of our own culture. And so for me, representing who we are as people of the East Coast and people of North Carolina is extremely important. And so what I'm talking about today is looking at these historic accounts, looking at the historic materials, the fabric, the fashion of our ancestors, and how do we make that play out in powwow, which is typically really flashy. Lots of beadwork, lots of bright colors, lots of dazzle and sequins. And so it's matching what we used to wear historically. How do we bring that forward to make it just as interesting as anything from the plains or the West Coast? Do you want to hit the next slide? So you can see the agenda. We have historic accounts, materials, and techniques, putting it all together. And then at the end, I'm going to have time for some questions. So the historical accounts are great. We have tons of images from the East Coast and the Southeast looking at what folks are wearing. Where I kind of focus in is that contact period during the colonial period, where there's lots of trade between us as Native people and Europeans. And so that's going to greatly affect how we as Native people are dressing, the fashion that we have. One of the things you can see on all these mannequins is they all have shirts. Now, historically, shirts aren't going to be something that we're developing for ourselves, except for those folks who are living up north in cold weather climates. But here in North Carolina and in Virginia, where I live, it's pretty warm most of the winter. The shirts become fashionable because they're new. Just like us today, people want what's new, people want what's interesting. And so shirts are like that. If you look at these two shirts here, they're more traditional styles of shirts. They're a trade shirt. They have a front ruffle. You may have seen shirts like this in Pirates of the Caribbean. They are historic shirts. They're of a French style, and a lot of Native folks prefer them because they do have that kind of flair. Now, this is my daughter's regalia. You can see where I've taken that shirt style, that same type of trade shirt, except I've done it in a wildly modern pattern. My daughter loves rainbows. She's a little girl, so of course she does. So I've taken that and I had one of my friends actually sew this together for me. So using a historic pattern and modern fabrics, we're able to create something that fits more in line with what we see in powwow today. The same thing for our footwear. Moccasins have always been here. Moccasin is a coastal Algonquin word that has its origins in Virginia and has similar variations in the word all the way up to Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Abenaki folks. And so if you look, this is my favorite pair of moccasins. These are center seam moccasins. Now, if you look real closely, it has Gucci on it. It has Gucci flaps. It's got the banding in the center. And then you can compare that to my daughter's. Moccasins like this, these pucker toe center seams, have been made here on the East Coast for hundreds and hundreds of years. Did they have Gucci 100 years ago? Absolutely not. But today, you see Gucci, Louis Vuitton, all sorts of stuff. And so this is my personal pair and my favorite pair I've ever made. This is my daughter's pair. And you can see, again, rainbow. It's got this metallic trim that you also see on the dress here. That metallic trim was originally used in officers' uniforms. So if you watch movies about the Revolutionary War, you'll see that gold trim on all that officer uniforms. It's a common item in trade lists. Trade lists are great historic accounts to see what type of fashion us as Native folks are requesting. They're very, very detailed. People often imagine us as Native folks not really being the most shrewd bargainers. The English talk about there's letters back and forth from the colonies to England where the goods aren't good enough. They're not up to the standard. And so we as Native people are not interested in them. When we look at the Southeast, the primary colors of wool that are traded in the Southeast is red and blue. Blue is traded at 2/3 more than red. So 2/3 of what's being traded is blue. Another third is red. We do see one-off accounts and other accounts of other colors being used in the Southeast. I have a set of leggings here that are based off of a Catawba set of leggings. They talk about white leggings being given to several of the headmen of the Catawba Nation. So I use the white leggings. This may remind you of those checkerboards that you see on the Vans slip-on shoes. This is a historic, what's called tape, and it does exactly what it does here. It's decorative, clashed with these blue seed beads on the edge, and you've got something that I can wear at a historic reenactment, but is also perfectly done for powwow as well. Next slide. So you can see some of the imagery in these images. You can see the silk, that match coat that man is wearing. That's that blanket he's wrapped around himself. You can see those bands of colored silk on that blue image. And around his neck, you can see a large silver gorget, just like the one I've got on the mannequin here. Silver is going to be a huge thing. You can see the silver armbands, glass beads. All of those things are going to be heavily prevalent. If you look at the woman in the second image, the more realistic of the two drawings, you can see on her wrap skirt, much like the two wrap skirts we have on the mannequins here, it's elaborately decorated with silk, glass beads, things like that. Do you want to hit the next image? You can even see in the dolls. These are great examples. Unfortunately for us, a lot of the stuff that was common doesn't survive. Just like today, you're not going to save a random pair of blue jeans. What gets saved are things that are really highly detailed or kind of on the more extreme end of the value, things that are well decorated. And we can see these here with the dolls. You can see these huge looping necklaces of trade beads. I've got some here. So these trade beads are also interlooped with the knuckle bones of deer. So that second knuckle right above the actual hoof. We find those in the archaeology where they've been drilled and used in necklaces. We have these robin's egg beads. They get that name because, well, the colors of a robin's egg. We find them all throughout the archaeology. Really, in the early colonial period, this is one of the most common beads traded in North Carolina and Virginia. And then if you look, pardon me, if you look at the leg ties of that image, you'll notice something that are called heddle woven. And so heddle weaving is something we see really primarily in the Southeast. It's a way of looming beads to create garters, bags, straps, necklaces. For us in the Southeast, porcupines aren't really native below northern Virginia. And so there may be some quill work within our communities that's traded from Iroquois folks and other folks up north. But for the most part, there is no native quill work done with porcupine quills, at least. So what we see in the Southeast being really prevalent is this heddle looming. And these are my leg ties. You can see they're black and white beads. And then they're stranded in with this red yarn to create kind of a really nice aesthetic. This pattern is based on an original pair from a museum. We've got other heddle woven stuff here in my hair ties. You can got a small one here, and then you can see some of the other stuff in there. The other pieces are finger woven, which you can see kind of in this sash here. This isn't necessarily the most historical example of the looming. There's, pardon me, tons of different patterns to do finger weaving. The historic style is more like these ones here. And I got these ones from a buddy up north. He did them in trade for me. I really like the yellow and I really like the blue coloration of these wools. It is one of the few things I don't do because I don't have patience for it. But it is commonplace as belts, as sashes, as straps for things. You can see one here holding up the bag for my daughter, another one that I did holding up my bag over here. If you want to hit the next slide. So these trade lists, that's kind of what I talked about. You can see the ball cone earrings in that image. Those are common earrings that are silver. So a lot of us on the East Coast primarily use copper prior to European arrival. You can see these copper ring brooches here on my daughter's dress. You can see copper cones here on these moccasins. Copper becomes devalued very quickly, and then silver becomes the metal of choice for us here on the East Coast. So if you look at a lot of my stuff, it's got this big silver gorget, the silver armbands, and then I've got silver wrist cuffs on my wrists. These are all based on historic examples, and they fit in perfectly with powwow itself. You can look at the moccasin there. That's a moccasin that's in the collection of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. It's likely either a child's moccasin or a woman's moccasin, judging by the size of it, but you can just see just how much detail is put into it. If you look along that front seam where the toe is, it looks kind of gray. They've studied it. It is a gold tape that has just kind of corroded. If you look at the sides, you can see just the same amount of kind of detail that my daughter's moccasin has, with the layers of silk, the glass beads on the edge, the tin cones on the front. Now mine is a little different. My daughter's is a little different. I've got a rainbow pattern that go across both flaps. This is far more work than you would ever historically put into a child's shoe. She's had these for about a year. She's probably not going to fit them next year. So this is a lot of work for something that isn't going to last very long. And that's something we can do in powwow today that our ancestors wouldn't necessarily bothered with historically. A child of her age may not have even had shoes at this point. Do you want to hit the next slide, please? So materials and techniques, you want to go past the next one. So if we look, like I talked about, silver is a big one. You can see some great examples, some arm cuffs, some large ear spools and wheels. You've got the ring brooches down on the corner of that wrap skirt. Again, same type of ring brooches here. Historically, ring brooches were never done in copper. So this is kind of a modern thing that people have done, making them out of copper. And I just think it looks really great with the gold trim on that black wool. And then you can look and see those strands of necklaces, all of these different trade beads. And there's tons of trade beads. Some of the originals are still available and they're fairly cheap, mainly because they were produced in such high volumes that they just survive to today, and they're not rare, so they're not hard to come by. You also have people that reproduce the trade beads. So like the trade beads I've got here, these are all reproductions. One of the other pieces you can use, and we see blended in there, are those natural materials. Like I said, we have deer toes here. If you look at the necklace on my daughter's stuff, these are actually vertebrae from fish. And I've got a large set that I've dyed red that are that my son uses, that they're catfish bones. There are skeleton, the spinal cords are already round. They already have a hole that actually links them together. So they're perfect for making beads. You just got to clean them and you got to get rid of the smell. And that's about it. Next one. So like we talked about quill work, that's something we see up north. Now there are great pieces of quill work that get traded down into the Southeast. We do war with our neighbors up north historically. We also trade and intermarry with those folks. And so quill work does make its way down here. The other big one is finger weaving. And like I said, the historic example is known as oblique weaving. And that's an example that you see in that picture. That's an example you see with the hair ties that I held up earlier, my hair piece. And you can see just how intricate it is in that image. You've got reds, yellows, black, all in one piece with the beads. And those beads are interwoven as you're making it. So they're not sewn in after. Heddle work we discussed is just like the leg ties I've got, just like the one hair piece in there. You can see in that heddle woven piece, you can see the images of actual men and women there. And then the other big one that really is equated with Iroquois people, Haudenosaunee people up north, is wampum work. The same type of shells are found in the southeast. We find wampum work being done. I've got a wampum collar that's not on the mannequin today, but I've got a wampum collar that I've made. I've got some small wampum strands that my daughter wears. So wampum is kind of ubiquitous. So all of those materials and all those techniques can be used to make an Eastern style powwow regalia. If you want to hit the next one. So finger weaving, you can see all the different types. So we talked about the belt and the sash. This is another style of weaving. It's called twining. So we can kind of see the difference in these two bags. My bag over here is a little more traditional. It's dyed red. It's dyed walnut to get the brown. It's a really simple pattern. Now, like I said, my daughter loves rainbows. And so this is an ombre patterned, and I use hemp for all mine. Hemp is really close to the natural plant fiber of like dogbane, stinging nettle, milkweed, except I can buy rolls with hundreds and hundreds of feet of hemp cordage, and I can buy it in all different colors. So I bought a black one, and then I bought this rainbow one, which is actually like an ombre. So as the strand goes, it changes from color to color. Really, really pretty. Didn't exist historically. You can see some of those other bags where they've woven in designs, where they've woven in animals, geometrics, all sorts of stuff. So we have always been just as fancy as we are now. We're just doing it with a different set of materials. If you want to hit the next one. Quill work, like I said, mostly relegated to the Northeast and kind of in Pennsylvania in the areas. And we can see it applied to that neck knife. You can see it on the flaps of the moccasins and those beautiful bags in the center. You've got a pipe bag all the way to the end. And there are tons of different styles of quill work. You have 2-needle quill work where you're using a single quill to create these really intricate designs. You have a woven or a loomed quill work, which we see on originals. So the Marquis de Lafayette is adopted by the Oneida. One of the few possessions that survive from his lifetime is a moccasin that's over in France, and it has beautiful loomed quill work across the toe and the flaps. And it's interesting that one of the few pieces from his life that survives is a piece that he got from very likely the native community he was adopted into. You can also see that diadem there with those red feathers. So diadems are just kind of a really broad term for some of the headwear that men are wearing that would go over the head. And then those feathers would kind of line up with the bridge of the nose. If you want to hit the next one. And then, of course, wampum. We're all familiar with wampum belts. We can see several great examples. Wampum is also used in pieces around the neck. They're used in bags. The kind of wide one that's mostly purple over there in the corner, that's actually a wampum cuff that would go around the arm. And then that small kind of round tube is a wampum hair tube. So it would be tied or laced around the hair to decorate the hair. So wampum isn't just for belts. It's not just for necklaces. We see it used in all sorts of forms and fashion in historic clothing. And so we can bring those forms and fashion to modern powwow clothing to represent ourselves. Heddle woven, that's a heddle woven sash. So it's a belt, and you can see just how intricate that is. That's hundreds and hundreds of beads. We've got that image of a man there, and then those geometric designs, very kind of similar to the ones I had for my leg ties, and I'll hold those up again. The heddle looming is interesting. It's a technique that comes purely from colonization. So the wool that's going to be used, or the wool yarn that's going to be used in the weaving, is not from here. The glass beads are not from here. Even the heddle itself, heddle looming goes back to the Scandinavian countries in ways of making straps and ropes. The big difference is we put all those materials together and we start doing it with beads, and it becomes a really interesting and really popular style of decoration throughout the Southeast for a long period of time. If you want to hit again. Putting it all together. So you can see a photo of my daughter's stuff minus the shirt there. You can see my Gucci moccasins. And then if you look, you can see the wrap skirt here. One of the things with the wrap skirts that I do, historically, they're not lined. People are used to wearing wool back then. Most people today are not used to wearing wool. And so one of the things I do, and I think it just makes them look a little nicer and finished, is I put cloth backers on them. My daughter's young. She thinks wool is scratchy. So she's got a nice, brilliant, vibrant rainbow fabric underneath. When we look at this one here, this one has a really nice kind of floral green pattern. I don't know how well that comes up on the camera, but you can see the image of it in the slide. It's a dark green with a brown floral. And so floral patterns are incredibly popular throughout the East Coast. So people always want to know, where do you find stuff like this? Some of this fabric is available at Joann's. The cotton here, the cotton for these. This is actually a linen, and sometimes you can find linen at Joann's. What I recommend is going to historic clothing and fabric places. So Bernie and Trowbridge and William Draper under the Sign and Unicorn are two really great ones that I get a lot of my high quality wool from. High quality wool is one of the harder things to find, especially in a lot of varieties of color. I just did a wrap skirt that was yellow for a tribal citizen, and that had to be ordered from England because there were no suppliers here in the United States that had a really nice quality yellow wool. Mitch Yates, colonial American artist, that's who I got all of my silver from. And he's an amazing silversmith. I got a blank gorget here, and then I actually had one of the silversmiths at the museum I work in inscribe a design that matches a tattoo I've got. And then you've got at the Eastern Door. He does a lot of really good quill work. He makes pipes. He does a lot of different stuff. His stuff is more centralized around folks in the Northeast, but it's still absolutely beautiful work, and it's something you can look for inspiration. Now, all of these folks here are doing historic work. They're not doing what I'm talking about here, where they're making it or categorizing it for modern use. This is for historic reenactment, but these are great places to either find inspiration or find some of the materials that you may need to actually put the outfits together. So I know we've got some time. I want to make sure we get questions in. So do you have some questions loaded up from the chat?
Definitely, definitely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we want to go back really big picture. Some of the questions from the beginning are you were saying that powwow culture came to the Southeast a few decades ago.
Yeah, in the 60s. So powwow culture and powwows in general really are a byproduct of the 60s and the Red Power movement, the American Indian movement, where you have people leaving the reservations. And so most of our traditional songs are word songs. If you listen to some powwow songs, and especially a lot of powwow songs when I was younger, they include vocables, which are sounds that don't have meaning. So in English, we have songs like that. It's Christmas time. Well, it's going to be Christmas time soon. It's not yet Christmas time. But if you think of the song Fa La 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 La, those are vocables. They are syllables that don't have meaning, but are used in songs to continue the melody and continue the song. So we have a lot of those same things. The reason those begin to be developed is because if you have someone who is Lakota and they're down in Oklahoma singing with Kiowa or Cherokee or Choctaw folks, they're not going to be able to speak the language, but those vocables are very, very easy to pick up on. And so those powwow styles, men's traditional, relies heavily on a lot of Northern Plains aesthetic. That large roach that's being worn by warriors and men out on the plains, those bustles and belts, the Angora anklets, all of those things are indicative of that style of clothing. And it's not something we really see here on the East Coast. Now, we do have roaches. They're smaller. They don't have the porcupine hair for the most part. They're small, kind of red, either round or teardrop shaped. My son has a really small teardrop shaped one that he puts in his hair. And I could do that out of any color I want. I could do it rainbow colored to match his stuff, or I could do it blue or green. Traditionally, they're exclusively red. They're mimicking that kind of woodpecker crest that men are going to be wearing. But today, it doesn't have to. It can be any color of deer hair that I want.
And so powwows are a celebration, a tradition that arose to reintroduce or to enhance. Explain to me, and I'm talking real big picture for people who aren't.
So powwows are at its most basic point a celebration of Native culture. For a long time, there were a lot of laws surrounding what Native people could and could not do. So an example, in 1979, you have the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which allowed and granted Native people for the first time the First Amendment right of freedom of religion. Prior to that, a lot of religious practice and ceremony was outlawed in Native country. When you look at the boarding schools that were being run by the American government, they were telling kids, don't speak your language, don't practice your culture, don't practice your religion, because these things aren't going to benefit you. And so, really, in the 60s, you have a revitalization where folks become really, really proud of being Indian. And so, powwow is kind of one of those things that is an expression of that pride in Native heritage. Yeah.
Terrific. And so, as that tradition came to the Southeast, why is it Southeast American Indians maybe didn't have the clothing tradition?
Some of that's going to be just simply how long communities have been experiencing colonization. So, for like my community and some of the communities that I work with in Virginia, we signed a treaty with the British government in 1677. So we've had 400 years or just over 400 years of contact. When you look at some of those plains communities or some of those communities on the West Coast, they're experiencing some of their first direct contact with Europeans and Americans in the 1800s. That's 200 years later. And so for a lot of our communities here on the East Coast, by the time that some of the tribes in the plain states are having their first contact with Europeans, we have more or less really kind of completely adopted a European aesthetic of clothing, of dress, of mannerism. You may have some use of language or traditional ceremony, depending on the community that you're a part of or that you come from. But for a lot of those communities, especially small communities here in and around North Carolina, not sticking out and not being different was a way of surviving. And so leaving behind traditional clothes and traditional belief, and in some cases traditional language, means it's safer for the community to exist in an area where, to be very frank, post-Civil War, being a person of color in the South was not safe or great. And so you have the aesthetic of, we're going to go to church, we're not going to sing, we're not going to do our dances, we're not going to wear our traditional clothing because that makes us targets. And so for a lot of communities, it's not that they willingly necessarily gave up this aesthetic. In some cases, they had to for their own safety. And so when you're talking about in this style of clothing, this style of clothing is from the 1700s, maybe really the early part of the 1800s. So you're talking almost 100 years later that some of these tribes in the West Coast and in the Plain States are being contacted. This style of clothing has just completely gone out of fashion because we're not trading like we used to. We've adopted very much a lot of the functions and facets of Euro-American lifestyle.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So I think you're demonstrating right here. We can see on the screen, but we have a question. I want to make sure um, these clothes we call regalia. Is that the term you use for them or
I
not?
use a
What
variety of
term do you use?
terms.
And are they clothes you wear all the time, every day,
No,
or
this
what?
is so I actually work for a tribe in Virginia, and what I'm wearing now is pretty much what I wear. I wear jeans or slacks, some sort of button-up shirt or t-shirt or something along those lines. This is, clothing for powwow. Today it's commonly called regalia. I think the one term I won't use is costume, which is ironic because regalia is just French for costume. So I will call them, dance clothes or powwow clothes or outfits. I'll use the term regalia. Um, Costume is the one term that really kind of doesn't sit well with a lot of Native people because it implies something that's make believe or not real. Think of more of Halloween costumes. But I'll use any number of clothes. I'll talk about dance clothes or outfits. I don't have like a singular term I'll use.
Good to know. And so you've mentioned several times that you've made these. So how did you learn to do that? How long does it take you? All these questions are pouring in.
So I have been making powwow clothes on and off since I was like 12 or 13 years old, as when I first started to learn to bead. And if any of you guys are familiar, the Native folks who are in the audience, beadwork is typically not cheap. My parents were not going to come and buy me a bunch of beadwork at 12 or 13 that I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep doing this, or I wasn't sure if that was the colors or the style or the pattern I wanted. And so it began very early on with simply learning how to bead. And then if you can bead, you can sew. So it really depends. The question of how long does it take to make something really depends heavily on how intricate it's going to be, how big it is. So obviously these are both wrap skirts here. This one, while it is more detailed, took a lot less time simply because it's a child's wrap skirt. This one here took a little bit longer because it's for an adult. There's more silk on there, there's more fabric. The edging on this goes all the way around. It's got this really beautiful edging. And then in here, it's actually got beaded designs across the silk. And I'm not sure, it's picking up a little bit on the camera. You can kind of see it shimmering and sparkling. So it just simply depends on how fancy you want stuff to be. I couldn't even begin to tell you like a time frame on them. I can do like a plain pair of moccasins, like a plain pair of adult moccasins. I can sew them together in a singular day, but going in and then sewing the silk on, doing any design work on the sides, doing the beads on the toe. I think these took me about 2 days to finish, and these are just kids moccasins, but that's because the bands of silk are skinnier, which means there's more sewing to do. There's more colors. So you're switching out the colors of your thread and then going over top with the gold trim on the toe. And then it's even got the gold trim on the heel here to cover that heel seam. These are well beyond what most people are going to do for kids stuff. But because I can make it myself, I'm going to make my kids look as fancy as possible. Things like this bag's probably got 30 to 50 hours in the weaving of it. And that's for both of these bags. This one's a little more because the threads are smaller. There's more patterning in this one. So again, there is no set amount of time. And the longer or the more you do this, the faster, the more efficient you become.
Got some more questions for
Yeah, of
sure.
course.
So can you speak of dyes, historic, and you spoke a couple of times about using dye yourself.
Yeah, so dyeing is huge. There are a lot of native dyes that we have here that you can get a lot of variety of color. One of the easiest ones to use is black walnut. Black walnut comes from the hulls of walnut. So that big kind of green tennis ball thing that the actual walnut sits in, that's the hull. If you take that, you can boil and it'll leach out this really beautiful brown dye. In fact, all the moccasins I've got here, they've all been dyed with black walnut. That's what gives them this kind of rich brown color. And you can kind of see some difference depending on how long it sits in the dye. You can get a wide variety of colors. I've got a set of leather leggings that were dyed with black walnut, and those leather leggings are almost Hershey bar brown, almost a black. The one problem with a lot of your traditional dyes is they're vegetable dyes, which means they have a much higher tendency to begin to fade. So if you look at this bag over here, you can start to see kind of some of the fading in the brown where it's bleaching out, and that's because of the sun. Some of the other dyes you can use. So there is a false indigo here. False indigo, it's classified as a dye. It's really not. It's an oxidization. Indigo is the same thing used in blue jeans today, which is why if you kind of scrape the top layer of the blue jeans, they're white underneath because it only changes the color of the stuff when oxygen hits it. But we have our own variety of indigo plant here. We have things like staghorn sumac, which can be used to give you reds. You have flowers and other pieces that can give you yellows or greens. And then really with the influx of Europeans, you have a lot of dyes that can give you a wide variety of colors, browns, yellows, greens, blues. Today, I really only use walnut as a traditional dye because it is more color fast than some of the other ones. When I dye stuff now, if I'm dyeing it myself, I typically use like a RIT dye and I try to get a really nice vibrant color unless I'm going for something more historic, and then I can tone that down. So like this red bag here, that was dyed with a RIT dye to make it look like staghorn sumac, but it's going to last a lot longer and it's going to hold. So for powwow, it doesn't really matter. I worked in a museum and wore a lot of this stuff. Working in a museum, we used modern dyes because again, it's about the longevity of the product. I've dyed with staghorn sumac. It's a really great color, but it does tend to fade out. So if you're going to look at dyeing, I use RIT dye. It's a good chemical dye. It's relatively safe. It's non-toxic, and it's easy to get a hold of at really any hobby store, Walmart, wherever.
Excellent. So someone wants to know if it's disrespectful to wear native jewelry out of context of regalia.
I don't think it is. So you see people selling beaded earrings, selling copper or silver jewelry. I think supporting any artist, no matter what, is going to be huge, especially native artists, especially if you're supporting native artists. I would say the one time I have issue with it is when we see stuff in kind of major chain stores that are taking native aesthetics, not getting those designs or those things from native artists, and then mass producing them. That's really kind of where I have the issue. And we've seen it in stores all over the place where you have a native inspired print or a native inspired fabric. Those are really my issues. But if you're going out and you're buying from an indigenous artist and supporting them, you can wear that stuff wherever you want. I don't have a problem with it. Other people might, and I can only speak for myself, but I don't have a problem because you've supported an actual native artist.
I think that's really important for all of us to remember that when we ask a question of a member of an American Indian tribe, you're speaking for you and perhaps your tribe,
I would say you're just speaking for you because
right?
there's folks in your tribe who aren't even going to agree with you. You have disagreements all the time about what's okay, what's not okay. Some of that's generational. Some of that can be folks who grew up in their community versus folks who didn't grow up in their community. So like that would be like asking any other person to speak for the entirety of a race or a nation and saying, okay, well, I talked to one person, they said that's absolutely fine. We don't tend to do that. We have the common sense and wherewithal to say, hey, obviously he's just speaking or she's just speaking for what she thinks. But yeah, absolutely important to recognize.
Thank you. So earlier you mentioned wampum. Can you tell us what wampum is?
So wampum is two different things, really. The white wampum, so I've got some white wampum here. Traditionally, white wampum, and it's these shell beads. They come from the center spiral of a lightning whelk, which are those kind of curved shells that you put to your ear and hear the ocean. The purple come from quahog clam or hard-shelled clam that we find really all the way historically from North Carolina all the way up into Maine. And those are cut typically into tube beads. In Virginia, we also see them being cut into discs, and in North Carolina, we see them cut in discs. Those are typically called Roanoke or Roanoke beads, and they look like the beads you kind of see on those surfer necklaces, the kind of Hawaiian style white beads. Those are common. We see them in a lot of sites here in Virginia and North Carolina, but they're just shell beads that can be used for decoration. That's what wampum is.
So you've spoken about some of the historic origins of some of the aspects of your clothes here. Is that what inspires you, the history, or where do you draw your inspiration? And you also mentioned your daughter's love
Yeah.
of color. So
So I think the biggest thing is, I grew up going to powwow. I was a grass dancer. I was a traditional dancer. I was a chicken dancer. But none of those styles are from here. The style of clothing, the beadwork, the style of dance, none of it is representative of my community as Sappony folks or kind of the broader North Carolina, Virginia communities in general. And so I worked in museums for a long time. I worked in the National Museum of the American Indian. I worked at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. I worked at Colonial Williamsburg. And so at those last two, I spent a lot of time in historic clothing, both pre-contact and post-contact clothing. Post-contact is my favorite. I feel there's a lot of things that you can do to kind of modernize that look. But it's representative of us. And I think we're starting to see kind of a bigger push in the North Carolina and Virginia Indian communities of dressing at powwow in a way that more represents our communities historically than representing folks who were out in the plains areas or out in Oklahoma, or even to a certain extent up in the Northeast. While the Northeast and the Southeast have a lot of commonality in their clothing, in the styles, wrap skirts are common, these trade shirts are common, breech clouts, leggings, all that stuff are common. Every one of those different folks has their own style, their own fashion, every one of those nations. So much like you may have an art scholar who can look at a painting from Europe and say, okay, well, this painting was done by a German. And I can tell because of these details in the clothes and these details in the accoutrement at the table. If you begin to study our cultures and our histories, you can begin to do that with our historic clothing. You say, okay, well, this was in this collection. It was collected from here. I recognize some of these colors. I recognize some of these patterns. It's likely this belonged to X community, Y community. And so it's the same thing here. It's beginning to create fashion that is representative of us. And that's really been the biggest impact for me. I love the beadwork. I love chicken dance. I love men's traditional, women's jingle. Those just aren't representative of us or of my community. And so that's what I really enjoy. That's where I draw a lot of my inspiration, is representing my community in the way that my clothes are worn, in the way that they're made, in the way that they're produced, and the same thing for my kids. You know, if my little girl decides she wants to be a fancy dancer, absolutely fine. I can't I can't necessarily sew that, but I will 100% find somebody to sew it. But I think it was important for her first set of clothing, her first regalia, to be representative of the communities that she's enrolled in and a part of. And the same thing for me. I may eventually do another men's traditional set or a chicken dance set. But right now, I like the fact that what I wear represents the community I'm from. It brings a lot of questions. It brings a lot of kind of better understanding that breaks down that monolithic culture that a lot of times as Indian people were kind of forced into. When people think of Indians, they think of teepees, they think of war bonnets, they think of horses. None of that existed here in North Carolina. None of that existed here on the East Coast. And so this is more representative of us.
That's amazing. So, um, you said we know you're a member of Sappony.
Mm-hmm.
You said something in a language when you started. I
Yeah,
don't mean to go off topic, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but share a little bit with us about that language group or what you're
yeah.
doing.
So Sappony are East Southeastern Siouan speaking group, um, distantly, very, very distantly related to Catawba, which is also a Siouan language. I am the president of the language nonprofit for my community and 4 other communities, 3 of which are in North Carolina, 1 of which is in Virginia, and 1 of which is in Ohio. And so we're in the process of language revitalization. So, like a lot of communities throughout Indian country, there's been a bigger and bigger push to revitalize the language. And so, what I said there in that introduction, Kihoihuk Mikura mention, is welcome you all who are here. Martin Mingi Kohanela. Martin is what they call me. Martin Nigas Shepherd Witokai. So in my community, we identify ourselves by the 7 major families. And so my 2 major families that I come from is the Martin family and the Shepherd family. And those are the major last names, kind of the founding last names in my community. So I'm telling you, I'm from the Shepherd and Martin families. So that's what that was. So that's kind of a formal introduction, or more formal introduction that we've developed, kind of in the process of doing language revitalization work.